Yay.
Sure, I guess. But is the angle okay? I don't know.
Like if people see the screen?
Yeah, people see the screen.
Do you want to?
If you back up just a little bit to where you normally be standing.
Yeah.
That looks good. We can probably aim it down. There's a controller on the iPad there.
Yeah. Can somebody come in and log in? Just Zoom, call in Zoom so you can see the images.
Yeah, I was wondering what that was.
Yeah, sure.
No, this is not. Where's the camera?
There's a camera right there.
Oh, no, yeah, it doesn't zoom. This one doesn't zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we can only control that camera now. Mute.
I did.
Oh. There we go.
I love watching people do that. They like freak out. They're like, can't press the mute button.
Okay, I'm gonna leave the mute.
So are you leaving the mute on the actual recording or on your laptop? Because you don't want it to be. Are you the one that's recording it?
No, it's recording over there.
Okay, good.
So I can leave.
All of that was recorded.
Cool. All right, we'll get started.
I'm Yervant. For those of you I mean for the first time, I work at Stack. I'm the CTO there. But I've always been fascinated with blockchains and understanding in depth, like and on an intuitive level, how they work. So I prepared this talk, and I hope it'll help you understand it on the same level that I understand it. Before I start, I kind of want to put a question in your mind. How do you get a group of people to act a certain way when no one is in charge? This is going to be the same question that kind of permeates through the entire talk, and we'll try and pick it up at the end. First, I'm going to start with an example. It's not working. Cool. There is an island called Yak. It's a real place, and everything I'm about to say is totally real. It's in Micronesia, and this island has a very unusual form of currency. These are their coins. They're called Rai, and they're giant stone wheels. And these are this is how they actually, well, up until about say a few years ago, but this is how they actually transact and make purchases. What we would call money, this is what they would call. This is what they would refer to. They're giant. They're about the size of a person, or maybe half a person. And you can see they've been using them for quite a while. Now, this is kind of unusual for us. We're used to money that you can carry inside your pocket, transact, move around with you. So how do they use this money? You might wonder, maybe when I make a purchase, I take my stone coin, give it to the other person, put it in, on their front lawn or something, maybe, show off how much money they have. Well, it turns out that these stones are too big, and they're too heavy, and also a little bit fragile to move around like this. So the way that they know who has what amount of money is simply by remembering it. Everyone in the community just remembers who has what coin. These are sample islanders. It's the only clip art I could find at all. So everyone in the community just keeps a consistent record of what coins are owned by what people. So they don't actually have to move them around. And they make sure that everyone's consistent with each other by just communicating and saying, this person bought this, they moved this money to this person, et cetera. Now this person owns it, and so on. If I want to make a payment, all I need to do is simply tell somebody or some people that I have moved this coin, or I'm giving this coin to this other person, and they just tell everyone else, and they tell everyone else, et cetera. And eventually, not immediately, but eventually, everyone knows that this coin has changed possession. Now, this is kind of weird. Just to clarify, people just keep mental records, and everyone has the same record of all the transactions that has happened in their mind. Now, before I delve into how this could possibly work, I want to tell a story of about 100 years ago. Again, this is true. one of the stones was being transported on a barge, kind of like this, across the water, and the barge sank. And the stones went to the bottom of the ocean. They couldn't get them back up because they're huge. So what do you think happened to the person who owned that stone? Like, what happened to their money? I'm going to answer that a little bit later. Just a question to put in your mind. Now, this system has a lot of advantages, actually. Before we go into maybe some of its disadvantages, one of them is that it's theft-proof. I can't rob you. For instance, like I can't rob you at gunpoint and take your money away from you, because what I would have to do is tell everyone in the community that this money has now become mine, and it's unlikely to go over well. Also, it's hard to forge money, because if, like, I wanted to say make my own stone coin and then tell people I'd like to make a purchase with this stone coin that I have, they're going to be like, I don't remember the stone coin existing. Do you remember the stone coin existing? No, he doesn't remember it either. Nobody in the community remembers that the stone coin existed. We think you may have forged this. So that's actually some kind of cool advantages that come along with this communal system of keeping money. But it still seems kind of alien to us. And so in order to get an intuitive concept of how this could even work, I want to compare it to things that we are actually familiar with. For instance, house deeds. When I buy a house, or when you buy a house, you don't carry the house with you like you would money. You can't do that. So how do you know that you own a house? What's the system that makes sure that people understand that you own this particular house? Well, there's a registry somewhere with the government. You sign a contract, and the seller signs a contract, and this registry keeps track of who owns what house. And that's the way house ownership works. The main benefits, or the main reasons why I might want to do this, well, there's two benefits that come out of this. One of them is if somebody tries to change my house, or alter it, or come into my house without my consent, I can call the government and get them to send officers to remove them from my house. And the other thing is that I can then, if I want to, sell the house again to somebody else. So these are the main two benefits that come with this registry system that we have. One of them is social enforcement, or government enforcement, and the other one is the ability to sell or give this item, transfer this item to somebody else. There are a few other examples that you can think of where we use the same concept of social consensus when it comes to ownership. Let's say, for instance, there's a purse snatcher and steals a purse and runs away with it. If we catch that person, we don't assume that just because he or she has the purse, therefore they must own it. We all communally recognize who the real owner is, and we return the purse to the real owner. Another maybe more applicable example is, let's say me and 5 friends start a car sharing program. And there's 3 cars that we share amongst us. And on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, I have it, and on Thursdays, she has it, or etc. Like, we keep track of this, and we all agree amongst ourselves as to who's going to have it on which days. And this is, in many ways, similar to what this coin system is. So it's not that unusual a concept, even though it might seem totally alien to us. Now, of course, in any system, there's going to be some bad actors. In other words, people who are either malicious or greedy, or simply try to undermine the system for their own benefits. And the same would be true in the case of these islanders. So what happens in those cases? What happens if somebody, for instance, doesn't have anything to lose, and therefore they start spreading false information, just trying to confuse people, or maybe they want to gain some of the points for themselves? Well, in this case, the bottom line is that majority rules. If there is one person who is trying to be malicious, trying to act in a malicious way and give false information, then the majority will start talking between each other and be like, this person said that he owned this coin, but nobody else seems to agree with him, et cetera, and therefore the majority consensus will be what is accepted as true. And once people realize that somebody is being a bad actor, they'll start pushing that person out of the community slowly, or simply not listening to what they have to say. This is how you would generally deal with bad actors. An example of being a bad actor would be, let's say I have one coin, and I go to one side of this island as a tribe member and say, I'm going to give you this coin in exchange for, this cattle, let's say. And then I run to the other side of the island and I say, I'm going to give you this exact same coin in exchange for a hut or something. Before they have time to talk to each other, Well, eventually, these two communities of people will gradually start to try and resolve these differences and start talking to each other and be like, hey, he said that he gave me this coin, this person said that he gave her this coin, etc. And eventually they'll realize there's some inconsistency. So majority consensus is how they maintain consistency. Basically, it's a social mechanism of doing this. And it is really important to maintain consistency. It's important that everyone has the same record, at basically as close to the same record at all times as possible. If somebody's, for instance, memory is spotty, or they just, they're sloppy with their memory, or they simply don't remember things well, they're going to be corrected. They're going to be told, no, this is the accurate information. And there's a reason for this. One of them is, as I mentioned, you don't want people doing any malicious behaviors. But another, and maybe even more important reason, is you don't want doubt to creep into the system. And this is key. If there is no clear consensus as to how much money I have or how much money you have, then in some sense, none of us actually has any money. Let's say, for instance, that this person believes I have 60 coins. This person believes I have 3 coins. This person believes I have, I don't know, -2 coins. I now go to somebody and say, I'd like to spend 5 coins on whatever purchase. So could you please spread that around? This person will be like, well, I'm not sure that you have 5 coins because this person's saying 60, this person's saying 3, this person's saying negative whatever. I'm not sure that you even have the coins to do this. I can't spread this information around. I can't allow you to make this transaction if I don't really believe that you have this money. And so where there is inconsistency, where there is doubt, in essence, all of us lose what we own. And that is damaging because you put a lot of value, you put a lot of wealth into these coins, which in a sense, you don't actually have anywhere else. So if doubts creep into the system, you could have the risk of losing everything that you have. And that is why the majority will push out bad actors. They can't risk the possibility that someone will undermine the system. So when it comes to these elders, you've got 2 concepts. One is consistency matters. It really matters that everyone has exactly the same piece of information. And the second one is that majority rules. In other words, what the majority believes to be true is true. It's history in a sense. Whether or not it's accurate, I mean, that could be an unfortunate consequence, but in reality, that becomes the truth. If the majority doesn't believe that you own a coin, you don't own it. Now, there's a certain concept that I've kind of been tiptoeing around that essentially encompasses all these concepts. It's called consensus. Consensus just means agreement within the group, agreement as to who owns what, and that consensus, in a sense, becomes true. This concept, this word comes up a lot within societies, within decentralized systems. Now, let's take these exact same concepts that we've already talked about with the tribe and try and move them into the digital age, into what are now called blockchains. To begin with, of course, the first blockchain, I don't know how many of you know, was Bitcoin. It's the original one that got any kind of adoption. It's still working. It's still in use. And it was designed by a person named Satoshi Nakamoto, and nobody really has any idea who he is. They have guesses at best. It's likely that he's not even Japanese. But he designed a system that in many ways replicates all the stuff that we've talked about with these tribes, with this tribe. And one way to think about how the system works is to go back to that question I asked earlier about the sunken stone. When this stone was being transported by barge and it sank to the bottom of the ocean, what happened to that person's money? Did he lose it? Well, no, actually he didn't. Simply, everyone just agreed that there is a stone at the bottom of the ocean and it belongs to this person. And now you can trade it with other people just as you could before. I mean, it hadn't really mattered where the stone was before. Why should it start to matter now that it's at the bottom of the ocean? But now you can take that concept and actually take it a step further. What if all the stones had sunk to the bottom of the ocean? Would the system still work? Sure. Well, that tells us that the actual physical stones themselves aren't really relevant, don't really matter to the system working. All that matters is that there's something that we all agree on that I have 60 of and you have 20 of and whatever. It doesn't matter that there actually are physical stones in play. And this kind of proves that to us. So let's go back to the previous model that we had of people owning stones and people communicating with one another as to who owns what stone. And we can just replace those stones with something I'll call Bitcoin. And it doesn't really matter what I could call them anything. It would be irrelevant. Now, of course, in a small tribe like this, it's easy for them perhaps to keep track of all the different stones that are there and the transactions. But once it gets to be once you get millions of citizens with millions of transactions, no human being can memorize all those transactions or keep them in mind. But fortunately, we have something that can do that for us, computers. So you replace the coins, the stone coins themselves with Bitcoins, and you replace the people that are memorizing these with computers, and you replace the communication instead of conversation. It's now done over the internet. And you have a decentralized system. Just as before, consistency mattered. Consistency matters right now too. Like people would be correcting one another as to their information. Well, computers can correct one another as well. Now, as an aside here, the reason, the transactions are stored in blocks of transactions. And this is largely a convenience. There's no inherent reason why it has to be done this way. But the reason it's called a blockchain is that transactions are stored in blocks. And there's a chain of transactions throughout history, starting from the beginning. That's where the term comes from. So what we would have, ultimately, is instead of a small tribe that's keeping track of all these records, you have a bunch of computers that are maintaining consensus amongst one another as to who owns how much. And we're trying to keep this as consistent as possible across the web. Again, there's going to be bad actors, just as before. Malicious people who either want to undermine the system or simply want to steal something for their own benefit. And if they don't play by the rules, they're gradually pushed out or immediately pushed out of the community or simply not listened to. And that, in a sense, is the transition from the tribal community, the concept of the tribal community, to the concept of blockchain. We have a community of people, all of whom agree that there are certain items in existence and that there are certain rules that you play by in order to make transactions between different people or different nodes, as they're called. And through that, they reach consensus. So the same concepts that apply to the tribal community now apply to the blockchain as well. Now, there's one concept that I want to end with. I'm either going to end here or there's another section, but I'll see if you guys want to learn about that other section later. But there's one concept that I want to go over, which is decentralization. And this is important because the question might arise as to why any of this matters. Why does it matter that we can design a system like this that is, in a sense, spread out between people? Because if we go back to the tribal community, they didn't have to do it that way. They could have had one person, a notary, who keeps track of every single transaction. Maybe he's got a good memory or she can write it down, whatever the system is. And that system would have also worked. Why did they choose to do it one way? Well, there are some downsides to that system. For instance, that notary could get struck by lightning. Or he could misremember. Or she could be mistaken. Or she could be corrupt and try to do things for his or her own gain. All of these are reasons to not keep the information in one place. Now, we're familiar, Canadian banks are actually remarkably stable compared to what's around the world. They're actually some of the best, some of the most reliable out there. But a little bit of a backstory for me, I used to live in a country called Cyprus. In Cyprus, when it was hit by the recession, was hit pretty bad. And they had lent out a lot of money to a lot of people who now in the recession just could not pay it. And large amounts of the money just could not be paid back in debts. So the banks completely didn't have any money to give to their customers. And so what they did was they gave everyone what they called a haircut, which sounds ominous and is. What that meant is that every person is guaranteed their money in their bank up to $200,000. That means if you have $50,000, you have $50,000 now. If you have 120, you have $100,000. If you have 2 million, you have $100,000. If you have 20 million, it doesn't matter, you have $100,000. And there's nothing that anybody could do about this. The fact of the matter is if I ask you like how much money you have, and you tell me, well, I have X amount of money, and I say, well, how do I know that? Well, who do we ask? We're going to have to ask your bank. That's the only person. That is the person who decides how much money you have. So decentralization in many ways is an attempt to get confidence or greater confidence by spreading that information out into the community, because no one person now becomes the single source of truth or failure. So that's why in many ways blockchains matter. I'm going to pause there to also ask questions. I have another section about smart contracts, which I can do if there's any interest in it, but for now, I'm just going to pause. And are there any questions?
So I have a question. I read on the news today. It said that there's some millions of Bitcoin being lost. So based on this concept, you are not supposed to lose a Bitcoin.
Yeah. So there's multiple ways that people can lose Bitcoins. One of them is that you can forget your password. The fact of the matter is, if every single account, like think of it like a bank account, it's more or less the same, has a password associated with it. And only the person who owns that account should know that password. Now, if you forget your password, literally you have no money left. Like you cannot get access to it because no one else is keeping your password. Now, the more common reason why people might lose money is because they gave their passwords to a centralized source. This is the most common, an exchange, etc., like that manages their accounts for them. And just as in a regular bank, if those exchanges get hacked, everyone loses their money. So in other words, many people are taking a decentralized system and centralizing it again. And as expected, when that central system gets hit by lightning, everyone suffers. Now, you don't have to do that. You can keep your own password and therefore only be responsible for yourself. But some people find it difficult to maintain their own passwords or maintain their own accounts. So that is the reason why, that is the only reason why, those two are the only reasons why anyone loses money. You either gave your password to the wrong person or you gave it to a centralized service and they lost it, or they accidentally gave it to somebody else.
So does that mean that those Bitcoin being lost is lost forever? There's no way to get that?
It depends. If somebody stole it, then no, they have the Bitcoin. If you lose your password and no one else knows it, literally, like, I'm confident in saying that there's literally no way of getting it back. Because the kinds of encryption that are used, the chances of you striking into your password again, figuring out what it is so astronomically high that you just can't retrieve it. So it is lost, and that kind of means, I guess the equivalent in the case of these islanders would be if one of the stones was completely forgotten. Is that? I guess that would be the equivalent. Any thoughts, questions?
I really understand what you've described in terms of the blockchain. Where I'm getting stuck is that the idea of this system has some practical uses. And where I'm stuck is, how do you attribute value to that stone relative to how I want to trade it, or how I want to sell it, or how I want to give it up, or give it to somebody else? And I'm having a difficult time kind of
So with the question
connecting
in
the
a sense,
dots.
how do I decide in many ways what a stone is worth as opposed to just being a stone? Like for instance, a stone could be worth like 3 cattle, which is more than the stone itself will be worth. Just like in any money system, the value of the money is dependent upon how much people are willing to give for you. In fact, that's true of any object. Just a cup of water. If you're thirsty, this might be worth more to you than if you're not thirsty. But the value of it is only dependent on what other people are willing to give you for it. Some people might say it's the highest price that somebody is willing to give you for it, or the highest amount that somebody is willing to give you in return. But it's always relative. For instance, you could say, "You'll give me $5 for this," but then the price of the dollar might go down. I mean, like it's always a relative system of what people are willing to give you. So the stones are the same. There's a fixed number of them, which means that they're relatively rare. Just like with Bitcoin, there's it's close to a fixed number of them. And what people are willing to give you in exchange for it is what it is worth, period. There's no inherent value that you can put into a system like this. Does that help explain? Or
But they didn't trade like one stone for one thing. Like, could it be fractions of a stone that they were keeping track of?
Now, of course, for the Islanders, it was one stone for one thing. You couldn't really break stones down, but they didn't have transactions as fine-grained as we do. Like, these were not I mean, they don't have like the kind of economy that that you can buy Mars bars and stuff like that. Most of that would probably be bartered or something like that. These are for very large purchases or very important exchanges. Now, of course, just like in the last few years, they've switched over to the American dollar. So in many ways, these are just ceremonial. But the system worked for hundreds and hundreds of years on this based on this. Bitcoin can be broken up into fractions. It's more of like the tool that you're using, really. You know what I mean? Like stones is just a little bit harder to do.
So going back to your example of the banks in Cyprus, and you're talking about the advantage of decentralization in that there is no one bank that can just decide we're going to give everybody a haircut and the max is 100,000, regardless of what you had in your account. With cryptocurrencies, blockchain and Ether, are obviously the two particular ones, they've just completely rocketed, and Bitcoin's gone from $200 per Bitcoin up to 7,000 or 8,000 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And there doesn't necessarily seem to be some advantage in decentralization there because it's gone up so fast and it could go down so fast. There's the fundamentals of what is driving the price of it aren't in the hands of any of us. So it's decentralized, but it's kind of gone unto itself. There doesn't necessarily seem to be. I'm interested in your perspective on what's the advantage of decentralization given the volatile price of cryptocurrency.
Well, for one thing, one of the things is that much of the volatility is described to the fact that it's an early industry, and eventually, once it gains enough traction, once it gains enough users, if it does, that volatility tends to stabilize out. But more importantly, in terms of whether or not volatility means it's no longer within your control. That's true. It is not within your control, nor is the price of the Canadian dollar necessarily within your control. The reason that people find it attractive is because it is in no one person's control or one group of people's control. In other words, it cannot easily be manipulated for the gain or loss of one group of people who essentially hold control over it.
But the Canadian dollar or the American dollar can't easily be manipulated by any one group of people. Like, you'd have to be a pretty huge group to manipulate the price of the US dollar. And the fact that it is stable gives somebody the sense of saying, like, if you give me a paycheck on Friday, I know what I can buy with it on Monday, and I can buy a house, or I can do a business loan. The stability of currency is a huge benefit.
The stability of the currency, for one thing, for the American and Canadian dollars, is largely dependent upon how much they decide to print. So in many ways, it is dependent upon, like, inflation can be controlled by one organization, the central bank. In the case of the US, I think it's the Fed that prints money, I'm not sure. So that it is true that one person can, to some degree, affect it, or banks raising or lowering interest rate can, to some degree, affect it. Now, so there was another question that you were asking in terms of stability of spending.
Well, I guess there's a trade-off there. You have decentralization where theoretically there's no one person in control of the price of Bitcoin or whatever, but the fact that the currency is so volatile has some inherent disadvantage.
Oh yes, sorry, yeah, that's what I was going to go for. Canada and America are bad examples. The U.S. is so stable, like the U.S. dollar is so stable it has become the standard of stability around the world. Canada is actually also remarkably stable, and our banks are relatively good. Most of the rest of the world does not have that advantage. Cyprus being one example. I'm sure the word Zimbabwe dollar has now just become a punchline as to how incredibly unvolatile that was. And it was largely because of the actions of the government. So it really depends, again, on how much you care. I personally am comfortable holding Canadian dollars because I trust my government, and I believe there are enough social checks in place to make sure that nothing untoward happens. And Canada is a relatively comfortable place to live. That may not be true of every single person. So it really depends on whether or not you think it is worth it for yourself. It's true that there's a lot of volatility right now, and that might mean that you decide to stay out of it until it stabilizes, or maybe never go into it. So that's a personal choice that you take. There are some other examples that I can give, by the way. Maybe like I've seen a few. This one I was going to bring up. Land registries can also potentially be done through blockchain. I was actually born in Lebanon, and my dad works in Lebanon. What he does is he owns small pieces of land and builds buildings on it and then sells those. And you'd be surprised how a government coup can suddenly obliterate a whole bunch of land that you thought you owned. And that happens very frequently amongst in many different countries.
But that's more of a smart contract blockchain application as opposed to
Potentially.
a cryptocurrency thing. So,
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap between them.
The other thing is, I guess, Bitcoin, its value is still essentially locked and tied to what it's equivalent to in a dollar, right?
Mhm.
Like, how do you step past that particular bridge or gap to the point where Bitcoin is the currency or whatever?
It's all consensus, because the fact of the matter is, like I said, any value is always relative, right? You're comparing, say, Bitcoin to the US dollar only because the US dollar is so stable that it just gives us a sense of comfort. But if the US dollar is going up and down, then it's always going to be relative. And in many ways, it's a choice of what you want your kind of like axes, your origin to be in many ways, what you're comparing everything relative to. Canadian dollar is not bad in terms of comparison. But again, even if you compare it to, say, houses or gold can fluctuate in price. Houses can fluctuate in price, as we've seen. There's never going to be one single thing. It's all a matter of your personal opinion as to what you want to compare it to.
I'm still into this value thing.
It's tricky.
And it is tricky, as Shane has suggested. You know, we associate so much with the dollar, and so let's put like the association between the US dollar or the Canadian dollar and Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency. And then what does that represent in terms of my real day-to-day use of it when the volatility of this new concept is not stable?
Yeah.
How does that work?
So it depends, right? Right now, the reason it's not stable, or you think it's not stable, is because if you took one Ether and went to a store, one day you could buy a chocolate bar, and the next day you can buy a car, and that doesn't make sense. But the only reason for that is because you're changing your Ether to the Canadian dollar, and the purchase is being done on the Canadian dollar. Now, prices are set to a particular currency. For instance, as we know, if the Canadian dollar goes up, suddenly you can buy a lot more American goods because their prices stay the same according to the US dollar. If it one day happened, which I don't know whether or not it could, that people peg the price of their products to Ether or to Bitcoin, then you would take that same Bitcoin and be able to, purchase a Mars bar today and a Mars bar tomorrow, because they are setting the price according to how many Bitcoin you need to purchase it, whether or not the price goes up relative to other things. Does that kind of make sense? The only reason right now that there's volatility is because all Canadian prices are set in Canadian dollars, not Ether. Does that kind of help?
Yep. Yeah, no, the concept does. I mean, it's still hard to wrap around my head.
It is.
Looking into the future, how that's going to evolve or not.
Who knows? Yeah, I mean, no one knows the future. No one knows whether or not this will take off in a huge way. But that's the main differences, the decentralized aspect of it, I think is interesting enough because it gives us, it's more than just a lesson on money. It's also a lesson on human behavior. It's a lesson on how to organize. And that was the question that I asked at the beginning, which is how do you get a group of people to act a certain way when there's no one in charge? In many ways, that is the question that blockchains in general are answering. No one person is in charge, but by setting up the right motivations, right incentives, and so on, you can get people to behave in a way that is cooperative, and also social people are being malicious.
That aspect of our society that is about accumulating wealth and putting an enormous amount of importance on that brings about often, probably, or many times, really
unpleasant behaviors.
Stuff that you don't want to have consistently as part of your sort of value system in this kind of people side of things.
So first of all, actually, just as a side note, one thing that I didn't want to mention, but it's kind of becoming pretty obvious, is this is this technology is a very political technology. In other words, this is not just VR or some cool new gadget. The core aspect of this technology is heavily political because it seeks to undermine in many ways other systems of centralized monetary control. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind. Oh, darn it, I forgot the question you were asking. Oh, the unpleasant behaviors. The way that the blockchain right now, Bitcoin, Ethereum have been designed is only one way of designing a decentralized system. There are many ways of designing decentralized systems depending on what kinds of behaviors you want to encourage. And many people have come up with very interesting ones, some more popular, some less. So you are, in a sense, doing a kind of like engineering across human behaviors. It's a very human technology. It's less about the tech and more about the human beings behaving within that ecosystem. So the way you design it can encourage certain behaviors, discourage other behaviors. And it's not like there's one fixed way of doing it. You decide what you want to encourage and what you want to discourage and make a system that works in that way. Which is, I think, what kind of makes it really exciting for me.
We got about 20 minutes left. Do we want to get another currency question in, or do you want to jump into smart contracts for a bit?
Sure.
Has there been any demonstrated examples of co-opting of these networks collaboratively? So a majority of users sort of back channel and then decide to maliciously or not steer the evolution of currency direction.
So what you described is actually, it's kind of interesting, and I'm kind of glad you asked that question because it shows you how the system was designed. Remember, I don't know if you were here when I talked about the concept of doubt and how doubt introduced into a system is risky because you all run the risk of losing everything you have, all the value that you've put into the system, anytime there's any doubt. The way that Bitcoin and all blockchains that I know of have been designed is that the only people that can co-opt the system are the people who have a lot to lose. In other words, if you start undermining a system, your power to undermine that system is proportional to how much you would lose if the system was undermined. And therefore, the motivation is that the more money you have gathered within the system, maybe because you put US dollars into it or something like that, you don't want the system to break down. You are actually far more motivated to make sure the system is consistent. Just like those people pushing out the outsiders, all they want is a system to work the way it is. Now, there could be a kind of like, I don't know, weird suicide mission where somebody would just like build up a lot of wealth and then somehow undermine the system. It's highly unlikely.
But I might also be talking about a 50% attack, which is sort of
yes, same thing. So 50% attack, depending on which blockchain you go for, it could be 60% or whatever. But again, that means that the person who is trying to do that attack has 50% of the wealth of the system. That means billions of dollars. What he or she is going to lose in an instant as soon as he carries out his attack. Is that worth it? Maybe you're crazy enough to do it, but most people aren't. Most people are economically motivated. And it bases, the design of these things is based on those intrinsic economic motivations where people can't gain more than they're potentially going to lose by doing an attack. That's the bottom line. And there are many ways of designing for this, some of them far more interesting and definitely more nuanced. But yeah, that's the bottom line. That's the way it works. Yeah. I guess I can, oh yeah, that was the one question. How can you get a group of people to act a certain way when no one person is in charge? Because that is really the bottom question. One question. So, smart contracts. The reason I added this section in is because really you can't really talk about blockchain without mentioning the concept of smart contracts because they are so interesting. It's such an interesting inflection of how blockchains work. So, Ethereum is perhaps the most popular known smart contract system, blockchain system. So Ethereum still has blocks of transactions, but within those blocks, there is a smart contract. Now, what is that smart contract? That's what I'm going to explain. Let's go back to our islanders. I'm going to paint a little story. Let's say that I'm one of the islanders, and I'm keeping track. This is looking inside my brain. You can see all the transactions that I have one after another. Then a friend of mine, call him Peter, comes up to me and tells me a story about how he's really anxious about his crops. And he's worried that his crops are going to get damaged if there is a hurricane. Peter has always been the anxious type. So what he tells me is he and another person that I don't know, Sumesh, have entered into an agreement with one another, a kind of insurance policy. He's worried about his crops getting damaged. So what he did was he gave 1 stone to Sumesh, this other person, and if a hurricane happens, Sumesh will give him 2 stones in return. That's your standard kind of insurance type policy. And he tells me this story, and I find it kind of interesting. And I go, wow, that's kind of cool to know. And I go around and I tell everybody about this. Hey, did you know that Peter and Sumesh have entered into this contract? They're like, oh, that's pretty cool. And now, eventually, everyone in the island knows that Peter and Sumesh have this deal between them. That if a hurricane happens, Sumesh will give 2 stones to Peter. Next year, tragically, hurricane happens. Peter loses all of his crops. It's bad for him. But we're not that worried for him because we all remember that contract that he had done. It's sort of still in our memories. And we know when that contract was like signed or in a sense or agreed upon. So we know that he's going to be okay. So without even consulting either Sumesh or Peter, we just give 2 of the stones that Sumesh had to Peter. We don't need to consult them. We know about this contract. Neither of them has to tell us. Remember, up until now, every transaction had to be carried out by the person who was doing it. They had to say, I'm giving 1 of my stones to this person, or et cetera, or 2 of my stones. But this one happens automatically. In fact, it happens automatically for everyone. As soon as everyone is aware that a hurricane has happened, they all know the story, they all know the deal that they went into, and they all just automatically update their ledgers, their lists, basically, to have this new transaction. So what you have here is a very simple if-then kind of system, like a contract, in a way, where if this happens, then this will happen. And you don't have to be told that second thing happens if you know the first one happened. Now, this is a very simple version of it, but you can come up with very complicated stuff. If there's a hurricane and it damages the crops, but, he was not planting something valuable, etc., you can come up with any kind of complex scenario. And this is just a simple example, but it could just be played out in exactly the same way. It's like each person's brain is a sort of computer that just goes, this is the first thing that happened, then this. If this happens, then that. Therefore, this happened, so do this next thing. So in many ways, it becomes like every node becomes like a giant synchronized computer. They're all carrying out the same set of steps in a sense, and synchronize with one another, just like they have to synchronize their transactions, make sure that everyone's agreed upon. And they all just carry it out separately, but in a predictable way. And so what you have now is one giant computer, in many ways, that is spread out or being duplicated, replicated amongst all these different computers. And that is the way a smart contract works. It's simply this addition of if, then, something like that. You can also store little pieces of information, but this concept is still going to be exactly the same. Where the system will play itself out as predicted. That's where that section is. Do you have any questions about that?
So how do you prevent somebody from changing the smart contract to say it's 3 stones instead of 2?
Because every person has recorded it exactly the same way. Remember, just like in your memory, when I told my my fellow tribe mates that it was 2 stones, everyone remembers 2 stones. So when that hurricane happens, they know what they're going to change. I mean, you could potentially go to every single person and convince them otherwise, but it's very hard. Unlike with a standard system where it's all in one place, you could change the code, you could hack into it and do things, but you have to hack every single brain, and that's a lot of work, and usually not worth it.
What happens if Sumesh doesn't have this 2 stones anymore, like 1 year later?
That's a good point. That's actually a very good point.
What was the question? I'm sorry, I missed it.
What happens if Sumesh, who was going to promise 2 points to the other person, doesn't have 2 points? Well, in this example, obviously, it's a little too simplistic, but the system is built in such a way that we would have to reserve those points and make sure that they don't get used. And Ethereum has systems in place to make sure that that happens. Now, if it hasn't been programmed well, the person simply won't get their money. But if the person has 2 stones, I mean, if Sumesh is still not completely broke, he will have to pay out.
But exactly what you said, like sometimes that's a flaw in like a smart contract.
Yes.
It's there was no escrow built into it.
Yes.
So there's nothing to prevent the person from promising something and then spending all of that either or whatever.
In fact, it doesn't even have to be malicious. If you introduce a bug, or if there is a bug in the system, it hasn't been written properly, bad things can happen. And they have lots of times. The DAO being the most well-known example, where $270 million just vanished because of a bug. The way they resolve that now is a little controversial. They actually went back, once they realized that all that money had been stolen, they went back in history. Everyone agreed that we're just going to rewind history and pretend like those events never happened. This is controversial because you have to get everyone to agree, and not everyone did agree. So you don't want to do that too often, because the chances of you being able to like get everyone to agree to rewind time and say everything after this point is no longer true is very unlikely. But it was $270 million, so most people felt like it was worth it. But they can happen.
Have you ever had to file an insurance claim before?
Myself?
Yeah. So like what I'm getting at is like, I'm looking at this and it sounds great, like the promise of just automatically having a payout or some sort of contract seems like if you were to apply this to insurance world, that their whole essence is like they want to collect but not pay out, like that's what they bank on. But they provide the promise of like, hey, if something does happen, I'll give you this thing. So like, do you think that would actually be adopted in that sort of space or like applied in that space?
The question is not, good question, would the existing insurance companies whose models are based off of one could say non-compliance, be willing to adopt this kind of system? Maybe that's the wrong question. The question is, will the customers be willing to adopt the system? Because as soon as customers don't care for your system anymore, it doesn't really matter what you want to do.
As soon as you provide a better
So you provide them with a better alternative.
Right.
And history is replete with better alternatives replacing worse ones. Now, that's not the whole story, obviously. Maybe there are some limitations with this. I gave the insurance one because it's a very simple to understand example, but it's probably going to be a lot more nuanced than that. There's going to be a lot more code there to make sure that people can't cheat the system, et cetera. How do we know that a hurricane has happened? That's a very good question.
Yeah.
Right? How you decide if it was a big enough hurricane. All the kinds of things that people will play into. There are some solutions to that which are very interesting, but basically the concept still remains. I saw a hand somewhere.
Why would Sumesh be wanting to create this smart contract in the first place?
Because he gets the 1 stone to begin with, right? So he gave me the initial, what's the word, deposit, or I'm not sure what the word is. So he gets 1 stone, and then if a hurricane happens, he gets 2 stones. He gets 2 stones in return. So if a hurricane doesn't happen, he's 1 stone up. It's basic insurance profits. So that's why Sumesh went into it. He was gambling on no hurricanes. So yeah, and again, it can be as nuanced as you want it to be. There are many other use cases that people have found where this kind of deterministic system, where people can't finagle it or people can't play with the system to their own benefits, is useful. Because once that contract is in there, it is not going to change. In fact, that is one of the reasons why those bugs are so damaging. Because you can't go back and go, oh, geez, I put a bug in the system, gotta rewrite it. It's not going to rewrite itself. I mean, you cannot rewrite this once it's in there. Just like you can't rewrite a transaction unless every single person agreed to rewind time. And that is very hard to do. Does that kind of make
So
sense?
is a smart contract also attached to a time frame?
You can if you want to. You can put a time, there's ways of putting timestamps in and saying like, yeah, this is the current date that it was signed into, and check if the current date when this, when we're carrying it out is greater than whatever. Again, you can put in what kind of math you want. You can say if it's greater than this, less than this, not equal to, all kinds of, anything that's mathematically possible, you can put in. Now, you can't do too much complexity because it is a relatively simple machine. But that just means that you can't put in too much processing. It can still do everything that a computer can do. It's just, don't try and get it to render 3D graphics, is what I'm saying.
And how does it work when you rewrite your contract?
You can't rewrite a contract.
You cannot.
No.
You can issue a new contract, I suppose, and ask that whoever's not on the old contract sign on to the new contract
Yeah.
to avoid the old contract, but I guess you can't force everybody to, so you may still have to abide by the old contract for the people who chose not to take a new one.
Yeah, in fact, that's in many ways the term you said, you have to abide by the old contract. You don't have a choice. That's the whole point, is that the contract will play itself out, whether you like it or not. It doesn't matter if you scream at the skies, smash your computer, it doesn't matter. That contract is going to play itself out. And so you have to abide by it. People can willingly do certain things and to kind of make your life easier for you, like moving their money, like you said. But it is as binding as a contract can possibly be, because so long as there is at least one node running Ethereum, which there's thousands of, that contract's going to play itself out.
So I'm just curious because throughout time you will have like so many of those transactions for a given like sell for those islanders, for example. So is there any way they can like void those like previous like those transactions that are no longer relevant? Just like keeping like time period that we only care about this period of time.
Oh, because of history, yeah. The fact of the matter is people are going to die, and therefore a lot of memory is going to be forgotten. In fact, what you're saying can be done, because all you really need to do is at one point in time know what everyone has, and then you just kind of like build up on top of that. And believe it or not, that is one of the ways that they save space for digital blockchains as well. Like because you'd have to remember all the history, and that's a lot of memory. But there are ways of saying, give me a snapshot at this point, and then just start building from there. And that's totally doable. All that matters is that this snapshot is complete.
So how do they define that snapshot? Like, what is the time? What is like the earliest time that is relevant to them?
For the Islanders?
I mean, yeah, I think for both.
Well, for the Islanders, it's really going to be so long as they have a consistent sense of who owns what at any given time. How they got there is relatively irrelevant. Do you know what I mean? Like, in fact, up until the current point, everything can be forgotten as long as your current point is correct. For blockchains, it's arbitrary. You decide where you want to cut it off. There's no rule, hard and fast rule. Because remember, all you really need is a good image of what it is like now. That's all you really need. The fact that you kept some of the memory is useful, but not absolutely necessary.
But is it possible the idea of maybe creating some like discrepancy? Say that A has a transaction history of like from point A to point B. From point A to point E. But for a second holder of the Bitcoin, he has because he's taking a snapshot. He has a history from point C to point E. So it's basically the second guy, he would say that, oh, based on my snapshot, there's a discrepancy between my record and yours.
It's possible, right? Just like with the Islanders, if word doesn't get out fast enough, then there are potential inconsistencies, right? For instance, if that guy who did the double spend, where he went to two sides of the island and spent one place, spent another place, if people, like in those communities, don't remember far back enough to say, hey, wait, this is inconsistent, we're going to rewind one of these transactions, then obviously, like, they have to remember enough to kind of go back at least one or two steps. Because there's always potential inconsistencies until, like, you're confident that everyone definitely agrees to this. And the further back in time you go, the more absolutely confident you are that, like, there is no chance that this is wrong. But the last few blocks, the last few transactions, you're not absolutely certain about, right? It could be that this is not going to go through, or this was a mistake or something like that. So again, it's a judgment call, right, as to how far back you want to remember. Most people's lifetimes for the Islanders is long enough to kind of have that background. And with blockchains, it's like you make a judgment call as to how far back. Usually 6 blocks is considered confident, like it's not likely to change ever. And there's incentives as to why that works the way it does.
Wouldn't theoretically the Islanders system break down? Suppose like Yaz got all of the stones, you just held them all.
Could. But here's the thing. What you're saying is actually another interesting aspect of this. Let's say he did that. Now, let's say everyone else is essentially destitute or doesn't have any stones. There's one guy there who is profiting from holding all the stones. The rest of us are simply going to start ignoring him and just make up our own system. Now we have these seashells or something, I don't know, whatever. And we're going to have our own monetary system. And he just lost everything because he built up his entire wealth, his entire fortune on a currency that, because of his abusive practices, the majority of people no longer abide by. And that's what matters. It really matters that people buy into your system, that they agree to it. This is where the value thing comes in, right? It really matters that everyone thinks that the system is reliable, trustworthy, has faith in the system, like really strong, almost capital F faith, that the technology is good, and that people are being good on the system. As soon as they lose that, then they're going to go to another system. And everything that was put into that system just disappears. Just like with money, right? I mean, suddenly if Canadian dollar isn't worth anything, all that money that you had is suddenly gone. And so the same thing, in a sense, works, where abusive people can only abuse the system to their own detriment. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Just one more, I guess, a question. For it to be finally effective in the sense that it's sort of adopted and used as a currency only, it doesn't have. It has to pretty much happen sort of all at once, or else there's avenues to exploit. Like what I mean is, doesn't it have to be detached from a fiat connection at some point to lose the ability for somebody to try and acquire, or do you know what I mean?
Well, not necessarily.
Otherwise, there's places in the world you can convert it to something that's far more valuable in practice.
That will always be true. There will always be things like gold, silver. It doesn't matter that it's a currency. Remember, anything in the world has value. There are some places that I've heard of that use where in large parts of Africa, currency is cellular minutes. People send each other cellular minutes as a form of currency in payment because it's so valuable to them. And because their money isn't as stable in many of those countries. So anything can be currency. How you say it could be animals. So detaching value from everything around it, I would say, is impossible. Because value is only meaningful in terms of what it's related to. And you don't need everyone to abide by, just like you don't need everyone using Canadian dollars for Canadian dollars to work within our community.
I think it will always be attached to fiat currencies locally for a long time. But like you said, you could, you know, some people may say, like, I'd rather use my cryptocurrency to purchase like cellular minutes because that's a tangible form of consumable too, right? Yeah, and then it'll just continue but in some places where there's no faith at all, like in parts of Africa, they're not even using whatever the fiat currency is, they're actually using cellular minutes. Yeah. So you could also switch that with, like, you know, Ether or Bitcoin.
I guess my thought is just around that. For it to become the currency of use, it needs to get to that stability level where it's not really because you can't have those jumps in, like, I have a car and now I've got
But the price of gas, the price of housing, the price of food varies widely from place to place too, right? So
for sure, and I understand this locally, but even locally, you know, if you invested in January $10, you've got a lot more.
Yeah. Like what you're saying is true. Yeah. In other words, for day-to-day payments, it really matters that they peg the merchants peg their sales to the currency that they're using, or that your currency is stable enough so you're not too worried. Like, for instance, imagine if somebody here was only accepting U.S. dollars, like that guy over there, that would be an unusual situation. But that's kind of the same situation you would be in. Whether or not that can happen or how that will happen, no one knows.
Yeah. As a store, you're still paying your rent and your food in Canadian dollars. So that's
assuming
what's interesting though is that there's a correlation now between the big banks and the use of cryptocurrency, and how are they placing value? It's got to be so incredibly volatile.
But I think they're going in and out. Like, they settle out at the end of the day or back to back with fiat, like Canadian dollars or something.
The big banks have actually decided to not touch this stuff.
Oh, really?
They consider it to be toxic. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but it is undermining their existing infrastructure, and popularly it's associated with criminal behavior. So they've decided legally it's better to not touch it. That could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing, who knows? It's their choice.
And what happens at the next stage in which an entity, a private entity, an organization uses this kind of cryptocurrency for payment or paying out or receiving? How do they evaluate it when it comes down to taxable income?
Again, it's their choice. Just like in many countries, they've decided, I know we're running out of time, we decided to adopt, they've actually adopting US dollars and will accept US dollars and not their local currency. It's kind of the same concept of a gradual shift to accepting more and more of this. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, I think in Cuba you can spend US dollars. No, I'm not. Some countries you can spend US dollars in addition to their local currency.
In Cuba you can, but not officially yet.
Yeah, not officially maybe. Yeah, cool.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming.
To ask more questions outside.
Yeah, there. Oh, because we lost the room?
Well, yeah, how do I stop?